Hello, I'm Murphy Daly, and here on Written by Murphy, I want to talk about why books and literature is important. I've spent a lot of time reading, and I even studied English literature in college. I love to talk about the books that I read, and I love to recommend them. But it's not just a hobby. Books and reading are important to the whole world. And it's not fair to not acknowledge that. So I'm going to take a minute and talk about why it's important. One of the first things about books that are important is that's the best way to learn something. It's the fastest way to learn what somebody else knows and you don't know. I just read this book. Aristotle in the Poetics says, learning is one of the greatest pleasures. Yeah, it's a pleasure. It is pleasing to be able to learn and read what other people wrote about and learn what they know. Books tell you straight up what people have learned. But books and literature are not just facts. They tell you what people think. They tell you how people view the world and what is important to them and what they are averse to. And books stay. When you write it down, it stays. And as long as someone preserves it, it stays forever. So we have some wonderful ancient books that tell us what people thought at the time that they wrote it. And the fact that they were preserved for so long shows that people after them continued to think it was important and valuable. Wow, so not only do we know what the original author thought was important and thought they wanted to say, but we also know that there were a ton of votes after that in people that kept that writing, kept what was written, and preserved it for future generations. That's really valuable. That it was important and likely pleasurable, because there are tons of important facts that aren't that fun to read. What I want to talk about here, though, is American literature. And I want to talk about it from the perspective of the immigrant, which is definitely the perspective of the outsider, right? Now, I am American, but because I was raised in a very not central part of America, not usual part of America, I was raised in an isolated part of Alaska, I have an affinity for immigrants. And I did spend a couple years outside of America. So I understand, oh, being an outsider is a thing. It's a real thing. And I would like to say that the literature in America can provide cultural touch points for someone who is an outsider. So over time, books were read by lots of people. Certain books were read by lots of people, and those books at the time captured the values and fears and hopes of the people who wrote them at that time, and they were preserved over time. And those same values and hopes ended up influencing the whole culture. And it may be that a particular person hasn't read those books, but they were a culture. They were taught by someone who had, or they read a book by someone else who did read the book, or they watched a TV show by somebody who wrote that and they loved the TV show, and it was really influenced by the stories and the values that were in that book. Which brings me to the next point about literature. It's art. Art is self-expression. Being able to express yourself in the form of writing, in the form of a book, poetry, a short story, an essay, all the things that a person could write, a piece of writing that someone could produce and publish and share with others. That's art. Stringing words together in a certain way, expressing yourself is art. And so art too is pleasurable. So as we consume writing, we get the pleasure of learning, we get insight into other people's minds. We also get to see, when we get that insight into their minds, we can see why history happened the way they did. If we get that time capsule of what they wrote, we can see why people made the choices that they did. And when they made the choices and took that action, why it ended up that particular way and not another way, which is fascinating. And then we can look at how people have chosen to express themselves and what they notice when they express themselves in the art of writing. There were times when the art of writing was very restrictive. It only expressed a certain way by certain people. And then it began to shift, and different things were expressed. And the way those different things got expressed affects the very way we see the world around us. That's really powerful. That's how art works. Art works by changing our perspective. So we get our perspective shifted by learning something new. We get our perspective shifted by seeing how other people view it. And then we can also change how we ourselves express. I can express myself differently in how I choose to write, if I choose to creatively express myself in writing. But what I read and what you all read allows us to express ourselves differently in the way we talk and the way we think. It's very powerful. And if we read merely for pleasure, we're getting pleasure. That's wonderful. But there's more pleasure to get by understanding what we're consuming and how it affects us and how it has affected people throughout history. So I'm going to be gathering what I think are representative works of literature from America, from America's history, not just made by Americans, but works and ideas that were influential to America and are one of the reasons why, are some of the reasons why America turned out the way it is, and things that would allow an immigrant to find a cultural touchstone and understand that undercurrent that might not be clear. So I'm looking forward to sharing that. This beautiful work of art, this fantastic, pleasurable experience of reading. Looking forward to sharing it with you all.